In 1997, a woman named Susette Kelo moved into a small pink house in a neighborhood called Fort Trumbull in New London, Connecticut. It was not a mansion, it was a modest house in a working town, and a few years later, she opened a letter telling her the city was taking it. Not for a highway, not for a school, not for a courthouse or a reservoir or a rail line. The city was taking her house so that the land underneath it could be handed to a private developer. She sued. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 2005, the Supreme Court of the United States told her the city was allowed to do it. Most people, when they hear that, assume something has been broken, some rule has been ignored, because everyone half remembers the rule. It is in the Fifth Amendment, the same sentence that gets quoted in every courtroom drama. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Two promises in one line, they have to pay you, and they can only take it for public use. The second promise is the one this story is about. One thing to set aside first, because it is a different problem. There is a separate question about what a government gets to keep when it sells your house over an unpaid tax bill. That is about the money afterward. This is about something else entirely. This is about whether they can take the house at all and give it to somebody else. So, what does public use actually mean? For most of American history, the answer was close to what it sounds like. A road the public drives on, a canal, a courthouse, a fort, something the public uses. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, that phrase started to stretch, and it did not stretch in a case about a house. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided a case called Berman versus Parker. Congress had passed a law to clear slum housing in Washington, D.C. Whole districts of the city were marked out for redevelopment. Here is the part that matters, and it is the part almost nobody knows. The property the case was actually about was a department store, a working business on 4th Street Southwest. It was not slum housing. It was not falling down. It sat inside an area that had been designated for redevelopment, and that was enough. The owners argued the obvious thing. You cannot condemn my building to fix somebody else's building. Judge my property on its own condition. The court unanimously disagreed. Justice William Douglas wrote that the community should be, in his words, beautiful as well as healthy, spacious as well as clean, well-balanced as well as carefully patrolled. The concept of the public welfare, he wrote, is broad and inclusive. Two rules came out of that case, and they still run everything. First, once a legislature decides an area needs redevelopment, courts will not second-guess it. Second, the plan is judged as a whole. Your individual building's condition stops mattering. Notice what has quietly happened. Public use has become public purpose, not what the public walks on, what the government says the public will get out of it. 30 years later, the court went further, in a case out of Hawaii, and this is the one that decides Susette Kelo's case before she is ever born into it. Hawaii had a land problem inherited from its monarchy. By the 1960s, 72 private owners held 47% of the land in the state. On Oahu, 22 landowners held 72.5% of the freehold titles. Ordinary families lived in houses they owned, on land they could only rent, so the legislature passed a law letting the state condemn those lots and transfer the title to the people already living on them. Look at the shape of that. The government takes land from one private owner and gives it directly to another private owner. The state never keeps it. The public never uses it. The court upheld it, and not one justice dissented. Justice Marshall took no part in the case. The opinion said the public use requirement is coterminous with the scope of a sovereign's police powers. In plain English, if the government has the power to regulate something, it has the power to take property for it. Courts should look at the taking's purpose and not its mechanics. That is the widest that phrase has ever been read, and the justice who wrote it was Sandra Day O'Connor. Remember that. Now, go back to New London. It was a city that had been in economic decline for years. It needed something. And then it got the kind of news a struggling city dreams about. The pharmaceutical company Pfizer was going to build a research facility there. The city drew up a development plan for the land next to it. A hotel, offices, housing, new tax revenue, jobs. The neighborhood that sat on that land was Fort Trumbull. Most owners sold, some did not. Susette Kelo was one of the ones who did not. And notice what her case was not about. Nobody was refusing to pay her. The city was going to pay fair market value. That was never the fight. The fight was whether they were allowed to take it at all. Because her house was not a slum, it was not blighted, it was not dangerous. It was a perfectly good house that happened to be standing where somebody had drawn a better idea. On June 23, 2005, the Supreme Court decided Kelo versus City of New London, 5-4. The city won. Justice John Paul Stevens wrote the majority. His reasoning was not that the city could do whatever it liked. It was that this was a carefully considered development plan, adopted after study, aimed at a genuine public benefit, and that courts should not sit in judgment of a city's economic decisions. And under Berman and Midkiff, that argument was very hard to beat. The court was not inventing anything. It was applying rules that were already 50 years old. Then came the dissent, and the dissent is the reason people still argue about this case 20 years later. Justice O'Connor wrote that under the banner of economic development, all private property is now vulnerable to being taken and transferred to another private owner, so long as it might be upgraded. And then the line that outlived the case. Nothing, she wrote, is to prevent the state from replacing any Motel 6 with a Ritz-Carlton, any home with a shopping mall, or any farm with a factory. She was blunt about who benefits. The beneficiaries, she wrote, are likely to be those citizens with disproportionate influence and power in the political process, including large corporations and development firms. And she said the majority had effectively deleted the words for public use from the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment. Here is the part that makes this more than a disagreement. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote Midkiff. She wrote the opinion that opened this door. 21 years later, she wrote the dissent against walking through it. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote separately and went further. Something, he wrote, has gone seriously awry with this court's interpretation of the Constitution. He also made a point about who actually loses these fights. Extending public purpose to any economically beneficial goal, he wrote, guarantees that these losses will fall disproportionately on poor communities. So, the city won, the houses came down, and then the story does something almost nobody predicts. The developer could not get financing. The project was abandoned. Pfizer announced in 2009 that it was leaving and closed the New London campus the following year, moving around 1,400 people to Groton after a merger. The hotel was not built. The offices were not built. The land that had been a neighborhood sat empty for the better part of 2 decades. As of 2024, the one thing that had broken ground there was a community center. Susette Kelo's house was not destroyed. It was taken apart, moved across town to 36 Franklin Street, and put back together. It is still standing. The neighborhood around it is not. 1 year before Kelo, the Michigan Supreme Court had gone the other way. It threw out its own Poletown decision, which had let Detroit clear a neighborhood for an auto plant. In substance, the Michigan court said that reading of public use was a departure from constitutional principle, and it overruled itself. And after Kelo, more than 40 states changed their laws. But read that carefully. How much those laws actually change depends enormously on which state you are standing in. A lot of them kept a broad blight exception, and blight is a word that can be made to mean almost anything. So here is where it actually leaves you. They still have to pay you fair market value. That never changed. Kelo is a floor, not a ceiling. It says the federal Constitution permits this. Your state is free to give you more protection. And most now do, to some degree. And the federal rule from 2005 has never been overruled. Which is the uncomfortable part. The court did not say the plan was a good idea. It said it was not the court's call. The neighborhood is still gone. The development never came. And the rule that allowed it is still the law.